Emeritus of Canterbury Cathedral. Just a story about my first experience of Dean Robert was about 21 years ago. I had a group from my parish in Wisconsin, and we made a pilgrimage to cathedrals in England. And the first one we visited was Canterbury, and we were there for a weekend. And we were so warmly welcomed by the Dean, by others at the cathedral as well. But I especially remember the Dean's warm welcome at the beginning of the Eucharist, welcoming our congregation from Minocqua, Wisconsin, and the kindness and welcome of his voice. And so I jumped forward a number of years until the pandemic, and we were all at home, and I think most of us were looking online for things to connect with in some way. And I ran across this video of this very man, and I heard this kind voice that had welcomed us to Canterbury Cathedral so many years before, and I began tuning in to those daily morning prayer services that Dean Robert and Fletcher put on, and it was in many ways a spiritual lifesaver, I think, and I think many feel that as well. But we're very fortunate that they are on a journey around the United States, as they have been many times, but this is a part of a itinerary that they're making now, and it's a wonderful thing because they're bringing, in a way, that journey to us. They're bringing Canterbury Cathedral, the Communion, Anglican Communion to us. So we're moving out of our zone a bit too. And so I welcome Dean Robert and ask him to talk to us some about the Communion. And
surely. Thank you very much, Edgar, and thanks to all of you for a generous welcome this morning and yesterday and the day before, when we had a chance to have conversations with you and begin to get to know Louisville and enjoy its beauty. A friend of ours lives here, Emma Medder, who is the daughter of a former rector of St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, whom we knew well then. He and his wife now live in Rhode Island, but his daughter lives here and wouldn't live anywhere else. She's really, really a Louisville person. And so we were in her hands going around the city, and she took us right onto the Belvedere, and we saw the lovely Belle of Louisville coming along in the sunshine yesterday. The surprise was that this is like a really good English summer, and we thought it would be scalding hot. And I think that you're enjoying cooler weather, and we shall probably go home, and by then I'm sure it'll be pouring with rain. But it will be lovely to have these memories. Fletcher, as you know, is a great cameraman and has taken snapshots of just about everyone and everything. And we'll be glad to have a time, won't we, Fletcher, when we can just write things up and say, oh, do you remember that? And across the summer holidays, I think we can think of doing that, thinking, oh, that was in, and we'll argue like fury because we keep getting places mixed up as we've been across the year to many places in the United States. But this journey began in Houston, at the cathedral in Houston, and we were responding to cross the Atlantic from an invitation of a church, very few of these, of St. Augustine of Canterbury, and it was celebrating a very important anniversary. And while we were helping to lead a course for Anglican Episcopal rectors at Yale, 55 of them, of more than 5 years standing, back in July, the priest of St. Augustine of Canterbury in Oklahoma City came up and said, I suppose there's no chance of you coming to our special celebrations in the Church of St. Augustine of Canterbury. And we gave a good English reply. We said, perhaps. And at that point, we actually began to see what the year would do, because it's no good crossing the Atlantic and just doing one place. So we started this time in Houston Cathedral, and then came up from Houston through Tyler, and came to Oklahoma City to be there with Father Joe and his people for the great celebrations. And from then on went to Kansas City at the advice of the rector of St. Bartholomew's Park Avenue, who used to be the Bishop of Kansas, Dean Wolfe. And he said, don't go back to the sides, go up the middle. So we came up to Kansas City, and then to St. Louis, and then to Louisville. And then we'll just have one more stop in Peoria, and then fly home from Chicago on Monday next week, and start again then. So what was suggested this morning, because we spoke also about the Anglican Communion and cathedrals at forums yesterday, what was suggested was that, first of all, we might talk in quick, factual terms about the communion. Now, I'm very bad at numbers, and while I generally I'm not wanting to rely on scripts, I thought there's no way I'm going to remember the numbers of the Anglican Communion. And what we're talking about at the moment is 42 autonomous and independent, yet interdependent, pan-national and regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury. If you've got that, you've done better than I have. But I do not know what the difference between a pan-national or regional church is. But what I do know is that the essence of it all is that we are in communion with each other. We not only respect each other's sacraments, but we actually welcome each other. There are churches which are Reformed churches, like the Spanish Episcopal Reformed Church. We've recently become trustees, Fetra and I, to a newly opened hostel for pilgrims in Santiago de Compostela. And this is an Anglican Episcopal pilgrimage centre where they come. It's called Casa Anglicana. And in case one sort of missed the code, that it's for us, but it's really for anyone who wants to come. And the pilgrims arrive. It's 5 minutes walk from the Basilica in an old hotel that we purchased. And when we go home on Monday, we'll be in England for about 4 days. And then we're doing duty for 2 weeks as priests and carers of the hostel there to welcome pilgrims and to bind up their feet and let them do their washing there and give them breakfast and supper. And they have nice rooms there at a very, very reasonable price. So all of that becomes that's under the care of the Spanish Reformed Episcopal Church, which is a church which is in total communion with us. And there is a wonderful bishop there who's been bishop for some long time. He's a larger-than-life character who looks like Mr. Pickwick and has lovely spectacles on the end of his nose and is always full of good cheer. And he and his wife have 3 little dogs. What are they? Yorkshire Terriers, are they? Yeah, Yorkshire Terriers. And I think they're called Candy and Sugar and what's the other one? Honey. That's right. And they just follow him around the streets. And it's a talking point. Wherever he comes, he's got there. He goes right across Spain looking after his churches and singing hymns all the way. So we'll be glad to see Bishop Carlos again. So that's the communion, which also has a global secretariat so that you can tune in and you can get all this on Wikipedia. And just go into it and see what is the Anglican Communion. And it explains itself as best it can on the way through. It's very active in ecumenism because the styles of what we used to call, in bad old days, churchmanship, and we now call ecclesial tradition, the styles of ecclesial tradition are different even amongst our own Episcopal churches. So that quite often in London, if someone is going around from church to church, they'll go into All Saints Margaret Street, which is full of incense and bells ringing and golden statues, and that is an Anglican church. They then walk across the road to All Souls Langham Place, which is a much more Protestant Anglican church with its plain wooden altar and all of that. And they say, is this the same denomination? And you say, yes, this actually covers a wide spread so that people have a wide variety of choice, and they walk around in that way. Out in the countryside, the thing holds good that every square inch of England is in a parish, and anyone in that parish, the geographical bounds of that parish, has the right to call on the services of the parish priest for help. Whether they're atheist, Muslim, whatever, it's a geographical location. People cross boundaries to go to churches of different types, but there is this sense of pastoral care for the nation from the established church. It's what being an established church means in that way. Safeguarding has become an enormous and important part of the duty of any faith community, because there are ways, if someone is in a position of leadership in a faith community, they do have the responsibility for folk, and there's an opportunity for it to be used badly with emotional control. And so all churches are now advised, and they all do, to look after the safeguarding aspect and check that all of that is good. And then there are 4 what they call instruments of unity. One of them is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who enshrines in his figure the sense of being in communion with the See of Canterbury, whoever the Archbishop be at the time. Then there's the Primates meeting, which happens from time to time. That's the lead Archbishop, or Bishop in the case, the presiding Bishop here, who meet together much more often than the 10-year meeting of the Lambeth Conference, which is all bishops across the world. And the Lambeth Conference met in July, but only briefly. It had been postponed from 2018 to 2022 because of, not only because the Archbishop, having been enthroned, wanted to meet all the primates before he could plan a conference, and he wanted to ask, should it be in Canterbury or somewhere else in the world? And they all said, can we have it in Canterbury, because we have common ground at that point, and Canterbury, with the university housing it, knows how to host a Lambeth Conference. But it then got shorter and shorter, and so it was really sort of 2 weekends and the week in between, whereas in 2008 it was 3 weeks long, more or less, and people had travelled across the world to be together at that time and spend quite a lot of time together at that time. So we can talk about hosting that when we go on to thinking about your hosting of the General Convention here, and what we found when we were trying to host a Lambeth Conference. The Anglican Consultative Council, which is something that meets quite often, and people are elected onto that. And so the policy of the Anglican Communion can be kept up to date as it goes through. And then, now this affects us all, there is a cycle of prayer which churches use day by day of the different places in the Anglican Communion. Generally it goes alongside a diocesan cycle of prayer as well, so you're praying for your own churches, and then today we are praying for the church in Botswana or something of that sort, going through the year in that way. There are many issues that are being explored, and you'll see that from the website of the Communion, like gender justice or theological education. But essentially, we've always been a church which responded to the idea that you are respectful of Scripture, and that's a really important thing. That's what I was trying to say this morning, of how Scripture relates across the board from Genesis to Revelation, and tradition of the church, which has developed over the ages. And some people make more of tradition, and some people make more of plain Scripture. And then the third one is reason. So if something seems sort of commonsensical, then the Anglican Episcopal Church very often says, let's just sort of weave that in, because society has really changed, and what this piece of Scripture is talking about nowadays can be interpreted in this way. And I found that right across the Communion, particularly with translators of the Gospels and the Scriptures, when they're trying to translate something in the Southern Hemisphere in terms of a crop or something like that, which doesn't exist down there, and Jesus is talking about wheat or something, and they're mostly on maize or millet or something, then the translators very often give go round it. And I think I was saying at one stage, certainly not here, that I had once in Juba Cathedral in the South Sudan had to, in the middle of a civil war, had to celebrate the Eucharist in the Cathedral Church of All Saints with digestive biscuit and orange juice. And you didn't ask yourself inside, is this valid? Of course it was valid. Anything would it wasn't regular, but it was valid. And I remembered an old friend of mine, his name was Victor Pike, who'd been Field Marshal Montgomery's chaplain in the desert at the Battle of Alamein. And he said on Easter Sunday that year, he found himself with the troops celebrating, because everything had been bombed to bits and Rommel was sort of just over the horizon. Everything was wrecked. His own caravan, where his chaplaincy stores were, had gone. So he said, I actually gave them dry bread and dirty water from a mug, but it was a sacrament. Because the words, as he remembered them, because all his books had been destroyed, were there, and the troops were wanting on Easter Day to celebrate Easter Day in the middle of all of that. So there is, that I would put on the sort of reason side of things. If you can't do this, then do this to remember how you do it regularly. But in fact, you can then still feel spiritually that this has happened. And if there's no priest there, then again, common sense would say that someone could then be the person who is breaking bread. But these are emergency things. We are people of regular liturgy. That's why we're Episcopal Anglicans. And I think you want to talk in a bit about the prayer book and things of that kind, because the prayer book is crucial to us, an ordered liturgy. But it's versatile, and it's become more and more versatile as people have become more and more able to read and understand what's going on, and in different nations, different, what would you call it, emphases in the scriptures. When we were in, where were we with the Spanish Mass? Was that Houston Cathedral, or I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah, afterwards. We'd celebrated twice, I preached twice to the regular congregation in the Cathedral, at the early Eucharist and then the next one, and then they said, could you stay on? We have a Spanish Mass with Father, whoever was there to take it. And we thought, oh gosh, we've got to stay on. This is 1 o'clock after having started at 8. We then had everything translated. It was the best of all, wasn't it? The music was phenomenal from all these Spanish guitarists who were standing there. So in fact, what helped keep energy going was the difference between the various congregations. So we'd had beautiful music, as we had this morning, in an Anglican Episcopal tradition, and then we had the music of the Hispanic music there, which was different again, and we grew used to that. When we were in Miami Cathedral, the same kind of thing happened, but that would be Cuban Spanish more than ordinary Spanish. This is all the stuff of the communion as you go around, and we can talk about that, but what I'm quite keen to talk about is what it means to be hosting something which is coming with different dimensions. Now, the United States feels massive to us. You could put England, well, probably the whole of the United Kingdom, into Texas, and you're driving on and on and on. And in the States, we grow used to it now. But in England, you'd be where you were in no time at all, except it's so congested and crowded, and it's difficult to get around in that way. So let's just talk a bit about the communion, and then we'll go on to the hosting aspect of this, shall we? Okay. Let's see how you want to go, Father Edgar. Do that.
Does anyone have a question, particularly about the communion? One of the things I think about, and this ties with us too, and you touched on it, was the diversity of the church, and it's a diversity of worship. Often it's a diversity that is of some theological differences, differences on certain issues, and yet it seems to me there's something at the core, not just in the worship or the prayer, but something in the core that ties us as Anglicans in a communion that it's hard to put a finger on it to say. But I've been to churches in other parts of the world, or I've been to other churches even in the United States that are very Episcopal churches that are very different. But somehow I know I'm in an Anglican church.
Yes, of course. This is something you feel in a great way when you go across the world to different places. The language difference matters almost less than the fact that the shape of the liturgy, when you go into a communion service, if you're worshipping, if I think of being in New Zealand, and I had a spell helping the Archbishop of New Zealand sort out the 3 strands that they've got in New Zealand. That's the Maori strand, and the Polynesian strand, and what they call the Pākehā strand. That's mostly you and me, the European strand. And we were trying to get some kind of accommodation, but we went to communions in all 3 sorts. It didn't matter. You saw the shape. And if you worship in a different language, you sort of know, oh no, this is the Gloria coming, or this is the Sanctus. The shape of the worship is the same. What you do lose, of course, is if the scriptures are read, and you find that in European countries, then you've got to know what it is, and it's best to carry your own scriptures with you so that you can just a small gospel book or something in your pocket, and then everything is in order. But order is part of what we do as Anglicans. There are portraits in the deanery in Canterbury of every dean all the way back to the Reformation, and so many of them are holding a prayer book with the finger in the page. It's shut on their hand, but they're holding it like this. And it was a sign to Puritans that informal worship, in the terms of everything has to be straight out of their head and heart, and anything written down is not real worship. We are people of an ordered liturgy. And as you probably know, that during the 11 years of the Republic in England, after King Charles I was executed, to have a prayer book was a criminal act. If you worshipped from the prayer book, that was breaking the law of the land, and you could be hauled off to jail. And until Charles II came back in 1660, that was how it was. And at that point, the Anglican Church was restored, the Church of England was restored. So you're sort of saying that there is this order, and there's also a sense of being, when you go into a place, oh, this is an Anglican church, an Episcopal church. Though we did have an awful lot of Roman Catholics who would come into Canterbury Cathedral with its altars rising up to the high altar, and with incense, and quite often the Eucharist sung in Latin by the choir, who would think they were in a Roman Catholic church, and saying, we're so glad to be here, that, you know, because... And we'd say, well, actually, we're not Roman Catholics, but this is the Church of England's mother church here. And so there is this sense of furring at the edges, nicely so, that people of a nonconformist type, for a long time in a parish church of mine in the countryside, I had a church warden who was a Baptist, but there were no Baptist churches around. And so he made common ground with us. And eventually, he never left his native church, but we gave him what would be called by Vatican II ecumenical hospitality, and we tend to have open altars to anyone who wanted to come and receive. Whereas there is a sense, it's why we opened the Casa Anglicana. There are some Catholic churches in the world which will say you cannot receive here. If you are not a Roman Catholic signed up and sworn in. In fact, it's breaking the rules of Vatican II, because the Vatican II says, if you are someone who believes Christ in the sacrament, it's as wide a thing as that, and treat that with reverence, and you're nowhere near a place of your own, then you can receive hospitality, ecumenical hospitality here. And we do that all over France. And you say to the parish priest, you know, we're Anglicans, but we'd like to. So of course, in fact, so often the French priests say, come and join me at the altar. And I say, no, I can't really dress like this when you come in from the beach. And so it's not exactly easy for folk if there's a really hard line about the thing. But the Anglican Episcopal tradition is not a church of hard lines. Certainly not now, in this part of the 21st century. So I would place it in that scripture tradition reason with a balance. And they used to do it with sort of high church, low church, broad church. The high church rested on tradition, the low church rested on scripture, and the broad church rested on common sense. But mostly people were a mixture of all three, and found perfectly good homes in anywhere they went in that way. Does that help a bit?
Yes. That reminds me of my bishop when I was first going off to seminary. But he had a saying that he would refer to the broad church as hazy, the low church is lazy, and the high church is crazy.
That's right. So, yes, that's right. I remember that.
Just perhaps a word about, we have our convention coming. We have A number of things that are happening in the next few weeks. Some have volunteered to be volunteers during the convention. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about how our convention may be similar to something in England, like the Synod, and how what sort of things there are in decision making and
sure.
How
our synod is different from yours because we are an established church. So the synod is the general synod is the only body outside Parliament that can create laws for England. And the synod can still, they have to be laws about the life of the church, and those laws have to go before Parliament, so that Parliament says, yes, this is according to the law of the land. But the established prayer book is authorized by the Crown as being the worship recognized by the law of the land. And that actually can be very formal business. You've got lawyers in wigs standing around. I don't know if the General Convention does that kind of thing, but the General Synod meets twice at least, 3 times, sometimes every year. And 2 of those meetings would be in London, in Church House, Westminster, which is something which was built just to house the Church Assembly, as it was called in those days, and once a year in the province of York, because England is 2 provinces. There's an archbishop in York, an archbishop in Canterbury. And we have in the Canterbury Library, there was always a row between Canterbury and York, was saying, we're actually more senior than you, Canterbury would say, and York would say, we don't recognize that. So when William the Conqueror came, he thought, I'm not having this, we can't have arguments like this, you'll all come and meet here. So we still have the document, and it's establishing the primacy of Canterbury. And then underneath is the King's mark, because William the Conqueror was illiterate. And then underneath too, the Queen, who was not at all illiterate, but she didn't want to shame her husband, so she puts her mark. And then after that comes the signature of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at the time was Lanfranc, was he? I think it was. And then all the bishops of England and all the abbots of England sign, and they say, conscripti, I have signed this. And at the bottom is John, Archbishop of York, and he doesn't say conscripti, he says concedo, I concede. And so we treasure that volume. It's there. Some people ask to see the mark of William the Conqueror. It's there, but we keep it as a sign of Canterbury. But no, all those things become important when any kind of synod meets. So that if it's always a summer synod in York, and we are gathered at the University of York, just outside the city, and we would go in for our Eucharist on Sunday morning, all of us, into York Minster. And in York Minster, what happens there is that the 2 archbishops walk side by side with their 2 primatial crosses. And one year the Archbishop of Canterbury will celebrate and the Archbishop of York preaches, and vice versa the year after. But that's not an international synod. The only thing international we ever have is the Lambeth Conference, which we can talk a bit about that. But the synod would be more like your General Assembly, of your General Convention, rather. And you've got very important work to do with a new primate to be elected as well. Does that happen as part of the work of the convention?
It does.
So we are praying hard because we utterly and absolutely love and respect Michael, who has been a tremendous friend of ours and has been to Canterbury on some very tricky occasions for him, sometimes just after an operation on his head, and he came far too early, but he wanted to state the Episcopal Church's position amongst the primates when they came. So we tucked him into the deanery, didn't we, and looked after him there, so he didn't have to spend all his time with the others in a hostel there, which we have in the precincts. And since then, he's been a great friend and has come back on many occasions, but there was one occasion when he and I sat on the stage of the great Cathedral Hall with a full audience in front of us. Audience is the right word. This wasn't a service, but we sang hymns which we had learned our theology from. And after he'd published his Hymns My Grandmother Taught Me book, and so he would say, do you know this one? And then he'd start singing, and I'd say, oh yes, I know that, I remember it. And that was good too. But obviously now someone has big shoes to fill. And I'm sure the person is out there, but at the moment we're all in full prayer for that appointment. What perhaps we could say, and you might, Fletcher, want to say something as well about this, because you were more instrumental with hospitality for the Lambeth Conference. What we did with the cathedral at that time was to open the cathedral specifically with resources for bishops and people who wanted to come in and find a quiet space. And in the 2008 conference, we'd said, just come in here. And I'd said to Rowan Williams, the one thing, who was Archbishop at the time, the one thing I won't allow is votes to take place in the cathedral which would exclude people. Because this is, Rowan used always to say, the Cathedral Church of Canterbury is mother's kitchen, particularly for Anglican Episcopalians. And you can't say to anybody else, she's not your mother, she's mine. Mother's kitchen is where the family can have its rows, walk out, slam the door, and, you know, but the door remains actually open for them to return. And in God's economy, 200 years, 300 years to get reunion again with a dimension and an arm of the Holy Catholic Church is no time at all. 1,000 years in your sight is but yesterday, the psalmist says. So all those things, you're trying to make people of all kinds feel at home and not awkward when they come in, because they're looking for holy space where they can sit down and think, well, that was a really bad debate we had up there, and I feel really hurt by it. And then you come into somewhere like this and open-armed, and, you know, these things happen. In any family, there are sometimes bitter arguments, and it might take some time to heal it. In the Garden congregation, we've had quite a few things like that, haven't we, where people have started worshipping again after being hurt by the church. And they've been able to put the television on and find us on the video, and then at that point, they've got in touch and sent an email saying, how do I begin to worship again? Or how do I make a connection with my family again? And Fletcher's better at this than I am, because he sits up late till 2 in the morning, waiting till America's awake or Japan's gone to sleep or something, in order to say to folk, look, just pick up the phone and start talking, because many people regret the row, but later don't know how to make the connection. And cathedrals are there to make connections. They belong to everyone. So at the same time, the docents in the cathedral, the shop people, the hospitality of a cathedral is really at a premium if you've got something like a convention nearby. Because conventions have difficult debates. And at the end, with a vote, there's a winner and a loser. And if a whole section has been outcast by a particular decision, then there's some healing to be done, and it might not be able to happen yet.
That's very good. Well, would you say just a few words about the Garden congregation?
Yeah,
for those that I know some of us are familiar, but how you began and where they can find it now.
Sure. Do you want to come and help with this? No? All right, sure. Don't want to say anything about hospitality or anything? No. Garden congregation began on 25th of March in 2020, Feast of the Annunciation, when the Archbishop had ordered all churches to be locked. He couldn't order cathedrals of the old style to be locked because he had no authority over them. So it was an option for us to say, we will stay open. We didn't close for the Black Death. We didn't close for Hitler's Blitz. We actually stayed open through all of that when people needed to say their prayers. And so there was an option to say, right, well, we won't, we'll stay open. But I think we felt that to stand beside our brother and sister clergy, we would actually lock the building. And then it was with a heavy heart, really, wasn't it, that we did that, and thought it was a bad decision, because people had never needed to be in holy spaces more than then.
I think you should say as well that there's a difference between shutting to the congregation and shutting to the clergy.
Yeah.
And that there are instructions as well for the maintenance to still go on. But
Yeah.
not the clergy going
That's true, yes, yes. So that a caretaker could go in, but the priest was not allowed to go in. And in the Book of Common Prayer, 1662, which is still the sort of foundation stone of our prayer books and liturgy for all of us, lots of modern things which are authorized, yes, but that's the foundation stone. In it, it says, if the parish priest is at home and not hindered by pastoral responsibility of urgency or having to be away that day for good reason, then they must go to church, cause the bell to be rung so that the people know that they are praying and the doors to be open for them to join them. And that's a sort of holy duty. And the priests were locked out of their buildings. So I would hear Father Anthony, the Roman Catholic priest, in his church, ringing the bell for Mass, even though lots of people couldn't go to that. He and his team said the Mass every day in church, and the bell said, we are praying for you, we're praying for you, as the bell rang. We weren't allowed to do that. So it was at that point that you said on that morning, why don't you take the morning office into the garden, open your prayer book, say the office, and we won't be breaking 1400 years of tradition. And we also believe very firmly that Canterbury Cathedral is all the ground within the monastic wall. So in the garden, we were equally in the cathedral, so to speak. And he said, I will bring a camera. Were you an expert at that in those days? No, nothing at all. And now this has grown on the way. And maybe 2 or 3 of our congregation might be helped. That's how it started. And then from then on, we became aware. Go on.
We did also say a private Mass every day to keep the chapels consecrated.
This is a secret information that we... So the building was not unvisited and unblessed, as the hymn says. So I think that was how it started, and what we discovered was the deepest of wells of need across the world of that spiritual dimension that I was trying to sort of open up a bit in the sermon this morning, that there is this sense of something within you which is not just plain thinking and mortal sight and brains and strengths. It's a spiritual dimension which speaks of the eternal and which only the heart can recognize. And it was that was crying out for nourishment. And it came from far and wide, not just Anglican Episcopal by any means, not just Christians. We had Jews, we had Muslims, we had Buddhists, we had atheists who wanted a rhythm of life. And what was helping them was creation going through its seasons. So that as we did it, every day for 26 months without a break, they saw 2 full liturgical years and 2 full human seasons with snow on the branches of the trees. And this was in Sydney, looking at from the heat of Sydney at the middle of an English winter, and vice versa with when we were in summertime and springtime, then it was giving this freshness. But what was listening was the heart, and that came across loud and clear, I would say. What was needing healing was some eternal dimension of which a human being is capable. And we then had to try to respond, but I set the tone as being, what would I do if I was going to visit someone in the parish? Perhaps they're new, or perhaps they're ill, or whatever, or perhaps these are people I've not yet met. So you go through the garden gate, and if they were there at the front door, you'd say, your flowers are just wonderful, and then you go in, and then they'd say, do sit down, and you might say, that's a really pretty picture of your fireplace, and they'd say, yes, my wife and I bought that, we were in, and then sadly she passed away 3 years ago, and I've come to live here. And so you then had a conversation, and then you came to the blessed sacramental point where they would say to you, would you like a cup of tea? And at that point, the one thing, however floating with tea you were from 3 other visits, if you said no, that was a stopper. If you said yes, then something sacramental happened in receiving hospitality, accepting it, and the relationship went on. You all recognize this isn't just a preserve of a priest, it's the preserve of anyone making a new neighbor. And from then on, there was a new relationship. Now that's what we tried to do by talking about ordinary things in the garden, or occasionally going into the house at Christmas time or something when there were decorations all over the place, or different times of the year. But mostly we were outside in the fresh air, which belongs to everybody. So it wasn't an Anglican place, it was actually just everybody's fresh air on the planet we've been given as our home. And it allowed you to talk about the care of the planet, and also to minister to the kind of needs that were out there looking in. And the result was, as you know, hundreds of thousands of people just became, and they called themselves the Garden Congregation. We never thought of that, nor had we intended ever to set up a congregation which said, do it this way, no need to go to church. It was very much, do it this way, and you'll see the need to go and break bread with a supportive community which you are physically part of. At the moment you can't be, but you will be soon. So do use this as a way of learning, and also a way of helping your morale, but don't think of it as a substitute for church, because in no way is it that. Christ commanded us to break bread together, and that could happen in a multitude of different ways.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question? Or
yeah, please be brave, and anything. We might not have talked about what you want to speak about this morning, but if there's anything. Yes, please, Bill.
Speaking of General Convention, I've served twice as a deputy from my former diocese to General Conventions, and on both occasions there were observers from the Church of England who were I'd like you to comment on, I don't know maybe you have nothing to say, but they were surprised, they said, that our worship seems so Anglican. I suppose they...
I think actually that you have to be in a place to realize that. I mean, it's years since we started coming to the States, because every year in my time as Dean of Canterbury, we would come across twice for the 2 meetings of the Friends of Canterbury Cathedral. But even before that, we would have known, because we had copies of the liturgy, and it was more or less carbon copy the same. And in terms of the way we've developed modern prayers of consecration, in fact, the prayer of consecration that I used this morning, which was set before me, I'd never used or seen in my life before, but it was a lovely thing to be exploring as we went through this dimension there. And we have these ways of being, what should we call it, imaginative in the way we use worship, and not losing the structure. And then you suddenly get this lovely anthem by Vaughan Williams, which you know really well, and you think that's brilliant. Music always brings you straight home if you know it. And the words of hymns and things of that sort. Praise to the holiest in the height, which is always amusing to me, because I've heard Baptist churches who will vilify the Roman Catholic Church singing that hymn, and they don't think, oh, this was written by Cardinal Newman. And because a hymn book is about the most ecumenical book in the world. But no, certainly the sense of being in an Episcopal Anglican church, and the glory of that is that it's not just a leftover from the British Empire, it's the fact that the Episcopal Church was sort of abolished when America broke free, when the colonies broke free, but at the same time other people then said, but actually we weren't using it because it was part of the worship of England, we were using it because it fulfilled a spiritual and a human need. So we've got to get it back. And so your church is a real testament to the fact that the Anglican Episcopal way is a valid strand of the Holy Catholic Church, and not just a historic leftover from the fact that there were redcoats here once a long time ago. So.
Question. Do you travel with all your own vestments, or do you use the ones
Yeah.
in the church?
I travel usually with one long white alb, at that point I say to the priest there, if I'm not celebrating, I say, can you lend me a stole and a white girdle, and that's all. But I then travel with the alb. We had a funny thing happen the other day, didn't we? When I said, where were we going? Oh, I know. It was Kansas City, and I said to the chap who was receiving us there, I'll be traveling with a white owl, and he said, oh, that's a bit strange. Yes, that's fine. And I said, and he overheard it, and he said, he thinks you're saying a white owl. So we were straight into Harry Potter, and so we now call the alb Hedwig.
Anything else? Well, we thank you very much for being here and spending this time with us. It's been an honor for us.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, friends. Thank you.